You're very welcome to the first Teaching Toolkit Thursday of this semester. This was a series we started last semester, and there seemed to be interest in continuing, so we are kicking off this semester with an introduction to assessment, and then I'll talk as we wrap up about the future Toolkit Thursdays that we have on the docket. Just wanted to put a link in the chat here to the teaching toolkit. This is what we are referencing throughout the presentation. The teaching toolkit is a resource on the UCD Teaching and Learning website and available to you there. And these recordings will be archived on the toolkit website as well. My name is Lee Graves Wolf, and I am in the Center for Teaching and Learning along with my colleague David Jennings, who is joining me here on the call. And we also have a student as partner working with us this semester, Alice O'Donnell, who I'll talk more about shortly. So as I mentioned, the agenda, I'm going to share just a brief amount of scholarship and resources around assessment, and then we'll brainstorm and share for the remainder of the time. And this certainly is not meant to be a sit and get session beyond this first part. We really want you to bring your questions or examples or ideas to the table as well. So let's kick things off with just a brief list of the functions of assessment. It is such a huge part of what we do as lecturers and teachers and tutors, and has several functions to capture student time and attention, generate appropriate student learning activities, providing feedback, helping students to internalize discipline standards and notions of equality, to give marks or grades, which is a big part of assessment as well, to enable those pass and fail decisions to be made, and to provide evidence for others outside the course to enable them to judge appropriate standards of the course. As you know, all of our modules have many different layers of checks and balances themselves. So our assessments are used to evaluate the quality of our own programs as well. So there's many, many layers to assessment. This is a wonderful diagram generated by work in the National Forum by our colleague Geraldine O'Neill. And it really lays out, I think, in a nice way, some of the map, if you will, of assessment, from summative assessments, which are those large, high stakes assessments that usually maybe happen at the end of a learning experience, and then formative assessments, which are smaller bits and pieces along the way where feedback is given sort of leading up to that endpoint. There are also some key decision makers and stakeholders in assessment. You have the teacher, or lecturer, and then the student. Those are usually the primary stakeholders involved. And then we have high stakes and low stakes assessments. And in the middle of this diagram here, you see a nice Venn diagram of assessment of learning, for learning, and as learning. And it's really nice to parse these three out. One that most people are very familiar with on both sides of the forum, either being assessed or being the assessor, is that assessment of learning. Those would be exams, end of semester projects, essays, those high stakes sort of assessments, usually given from the teacher to the student. And then we have assessment for learning, maybe small graded MCQs, class participation, where we are trying to find out if learning is happening and where it is happening. And then another one that may not be as familiar from a vernacular sort of perspective is assessment as learning, that the act of assessment itself is a learning activity and is assessment. And so you can use things like peer review, self-evaluation, that self-judgment, that engagement in the work of assessment as assessment itself. And in a few minutes, I'll talk about the the different types of key assessments that are recognized here at UCD. I also wanted to mention a couple terms around assessment. We in our unit have a focus this year on assessment for inclusion. And then you might hear another term, authentic assessment, and there's some overlap between these two words as well. So assessment for inclusion um, is when you're thinking about assessment as diverse, manageable, scaffolded, all of these terms that are kind of popping up when we're trying to be inclusive around the types of assessments that we create and give. And then there's this idea of assessment being authentic, real world, challenging, solving problems of today, collaborative, things that students might need and learners might need to do in the discipline beyond what they might do in a classroom setting. And then there's kind of the overlap where these both authentic and inclusive assessments are meaningful. There's that self-evaluation aspect, self-reflection, and student identity as at the core there. So I thought I'd give some examples briefly of assessments that are inclusive, and you'll see there's some overlap to some of this work as well. So choice of assessment is something that we talk a lot about in our, we have a module on assessment that runs through the program here, and many workshops, and choice is one of the big things that we talk about. And there's many ways that you can give students and learners choice in assessment. It may be in the modality of assessment that they could write an essay or create a video or a podcast that is equivalent work across those three types of choice. There might be choice in topics. So everyone might be required to write an essay if writing is something that's really important in a disciplinary perspective, but there might be choice with topic or things below. And we've linked out here in the slides, which I'll also put a link to in a moment in the chat, around case studies and additional scaffolds for this idea of choice of assessment. Another important thing to keep in mind is transparency in assessment and demystifying the whole process. Sometimes it feels like you might turn in a paper or an exam and it goes into a void and comes back with marking. So how can we try to demystify some of the pieces of that process? Creating rubrics is a great way to address this, and a strategy as well. And then we have a case study here from a design perspective, an art and design faculty member talking about words, around assessment and how those can be demystified. Manageable assessment load is a really hot topic, not just for students, but for faculty as well. When we're teaching large classes, managing loads and loads of assessments coming in, volume of assessment is a really important thing to keep in mind. And it's something that comes up in surveys as well as a number one concern on the student side, that there might be loads of assessment at the end of a semester. They're feeling overloaded with things. So there's lots of things to keep in mind when it comes to making assessments manageable for students. And again, something we can continue to talk about, but we've got some resources to start to think through things along those ways. So I mentioned earlier that I wanted to talk about the key assessment types, and these are the different types of assessments that you can select in the module descriptor. There's common language associated with all of these, and it really helps to show that that variety and the choices that we have and the types of assessments that we give. And reflection, portfolio assignments, group projects are all valid types of assessment that can be given here at UCD. And again, back to that assessment as inclusion, we're thinking about the different ways that students can demonstrate their knowledge, and these are all different ways that can be facilitated. And I don't think we can mention the word assessment these days without bringing in artificial intelligence. It's quite it's been the topic of conversation since ChatGPT was released to the public last year. And there are some guidelines at the national level around artificial intelligence and how that can be used. And I've linked to that report here for you to look through. And additionally, there's work on academic integrity is another big topic when we talk about assessment and artificial intelligence and how those intersect, and the idea of artificial intelligence and assessment for inclusion, an emerging topic of discussion with both pros and cons. The fact that AI can help with accessibility, scaffolding students, scaffolding writing, scaffolding thinking. Cons being that the algorithms driving the AI are inherently biased. There's cost issues associated with them that exacerbate the digital divide. So lots of things to think about in this area. And with those sort of fire hose of ideas, we'd like to leave you and maybe even start our conversation here with some questions to consider in these three different domains. And hopefully these questions can help prompt our own conversation, or things that you can bookmark as you're sort of reviewing and tweaking and updating your assessments for this semester. Questions you can ask of those assessments to help your thinking. So the first bank of questions here are around assessment for inclusion. Some questions you can ask yourself are your assessments fair and equitable to all students? Do they empower students in learning? Do they support students' participation in the assessment? And participation can take many forms, as we know. Are they flexible and allow student choice? Do they scaffold learning? Are they transparent and clear? Are they manageable, not overloaded? And how would someone who may presently be feeling excluded feel experiencing this assessment? Thinking about your assessments in relation to authenticity, do they link to real life problems or opportunities? Are they cognitively challenging? Do they support students to self-evaluate? Do they support student collaboration? And do students develop their sense of self-identity in this assessment? And as you can imagine, that each of these questions and the answers to them can vary widely depending on discipline, right? All of the disciplines have different contexts. So we want to keep our own contexts in mind as we're answering the question. One of my mentors always said to me, never say best practice, that there's no such thing as a best practice, but there are well-informed practices. And I think keeping that in mind as we answer these questions for ourselves and with our colleagues in our discipline, knowing that there might be widely different answers to these questions that are quote unquote right in our own disciplines that may not work in others as well. And finally, a couple questions to consider with artificial intelligence, again, being such a really timely topic associated with assessment. Can or should AI be used to create the assessment? If so, how, why, or why not? And thinking there's a lot of focus sometimes on students using artificial intelligence, but faculty are using it as well. And we want to think about both sides of the proverbial coin there. Can AI be used to complete the assignment? What are the benefits and risks of using AI in the assessment, and what AI literacies are needed if AI is used in a particular assessment? So lots of things to chew on and think about there as we move into the discussion piece. But before we stop the recording, just want to remind and plug the remainder of the Teaching Toolkit sessions. Our next session on February 15th, we'll be talking about supporting student learning, and that will be facilitated by our student as partner. So we're really looking forward to that session. And on March 21st, we'll have a session on delivering a lecture.